Okay, in theory, this is recording again. I think I will, don't know why it stopped. Okay, economic inequality. I was talking about neoliberalism. I had a phone call and had to interrupt our meeting. Um, Neoliberalism can best be thought of as the idea that the market is always right. The market prices for things are the correct price. That is axiomatic for many economists these days, neoclassical economists for the most, as well as a few other uh, economists who are really oriented towards maintaining a free market with minimal government interference, if any, except when it's considered necessary, like when the taxpayers had to bail out the banks in 2008 to keep the financial system from collapsing. Um, the banks, having been saved, weren't quite as uh, appreciative of that aid, perhaps, as they might have been, but that's another story. So, but again, Bill Clinton, I mentioned, it was during the Clinton administration that neoliberalism really became dogma in the United States. Not only did we have NAFTA and the end of welfare as we know it, as President Clinton boasted, by getting rid of a couple of programs that had been around for quite some time and provided support, longer term social support for families, and replaced it with short-term support with stringent work requirements. But one of the big things was after the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was a law was passed, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which prohibited banks from speculating on the stock market with their depositors' money. They put a firewall between banking and investment. They could not be the same entity. But this was in 1992, under Clinton's sponsorship, that law was repealed. Another law was passed that superseded it, strictly speaking. So, neoliberals think that if everyone, follows their own self-interest, just pursuing whatever it is that's important to you and not thinking about others, that's going to work out best for society as a whole. That belief definitely derives from Adam Smith, and they share that, hence the term liberalism. Now, what was there before Smithian liberalism? Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations outlined his views, which were an attack on the predominant economic system in Britain and many European countries at the time, called mercantilism, which was the idea that a country needed to maintain a favorable balance of trade so that it had more gold than other nations. That was the key thing: have more gold coming in than going out. Now, if you could get this gold simply by taking it from someone, for instance, as the Spanish did in the New World, taking it from the Aztecs, and silver, also particularly silver mining, that was good too. So the military could be, an adjunct of an important partner in economic growth and development. Marx would have called what was going on there primitive accumulation. They were preparing the ground for the capitalist economy, uprooting older societies that did not necessarily live through market exchange, through buying and selling on a market of some sort. So, although there were markets of a sort. So anyway, also there had been, in the 1940s, in the post-war era, I talked about this, I think, in part one, a sort of a social contract between capital, the owners of factories and mines and so forth, and just owners of money, and workers. There were contracts were made between corporations and unions. The unions would agree not to go on strike in exchange for a contract which guaranteed a steady increase in salaries. That kind of fell apart neoliberalism's fall. Also, the entire system that regulated post trade between nations of the world in the aftermath of the Second World War that was set up to kind of get the global economy going again, the Bretton Woods system, that had also fallen apart and is completely gone now. So the Bretton Woods system had controls on investments in other nations and capital controls. You couldn't simply take money you earned in one country and invest it all elsewhere. There were limitations to how much capital money you could use for other purposes outside the territory of a given nation. So also another aspect of neoliberalism is involved privatizing public services, where you might have had a garbage collection that a city government provided. It might have become privatized rather than the city hire people to collect garbage and buy garbage trucks. They would make a contract with a private entity to perform that service. There are a number of services that were privatized, some that never really could be. And a key aspect of neoliberalism, as I mentioned, it was weakening of labor unions and limiting their ability, where they still existed, to bargain for wage increases on behalf of their employees. So it was kind of, rather than wages being determined by negotiations between the workers and capital, it was basically set by the market. Wages would, as long as a corporation could find people willing to work for those wages, that was what was paid. So, okay, again, having, neoliberalism is still with us. Some thought it collapsed with the financial crisis of 2008, because part of what brought on that was the fact there were few limitations on what banks could do with their depositors' money. It was a Wild West economically, for the most part, in many ways, up until that point. It's really an amazing story. I don't have time to get into it now. I'll touch upon it later if and when I record a lecture on the economy as a social system. So let's go back again to the difference between wealth and income. Wealth is the accumulated value of all the stuff you've bought or inherited: houses, land, stocks and bonds, insurance policies. Income is the payments you get for working. So wealth is even more disproportionately held by upper level households, because it tends to accumulate. You can pass it down over generations. And you also definitely see a racial component to that. By racial, I mean the racial dimension, in that since non-whites tend to make less income than the dominant group, which are the whites in this society. But I'm not saying that as a normative thing, that it's right. I'm just saying that generally, if you look at the people in power, they look somewhat the same. They look sort of like me. They're white and male, and so definitely more powerful than their numbers would suggest is equitable. So, and if you have wealth, if you've accumulated a lot more than you need to live on, you can use that wealth to further enhance your wealth. You can make contributions to political candidates who are in favor of tax cuts or preferential tax treatment for some activity you're involved in, through your contributions to philanthropic organizations, and particularly your contributions perhaps to elite colleges and universities. You get a little bit of pull in those in those dimensions. And one thing I want to mention, I don't want to leave it out, the biggest predictor of your income, where you're going to end up economically, what class you're going to be in, is your level of education. Now, that's the best predictor overall. Some say the United States is a meritocracy. We are paid based upon our skills, our native talents, and our training, and that things like luck and connections have little to do with it. The idea of that the U.S. is a meritocracy is an aspect of the American ideology. It's not necessarily the case. You definitely can get ahead further if you start ahead to begin with. If you're already one of the in an upper class family, it's particularly if maybe your father or grandfather or mother went to one of the elite colleges, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you're much more likely to be admitted to those universities because they have what's called a legacy system. So your ability to gain admission is related to what your parents and grandparents and so forth have done as regards attending that school. The children and grandchildren of former alumni have a leg up, and the universities are very closed-mouthed about how that works. So what you find is the children of the wealthy are getting access to educations and universities that tend to confer the ability to get high-paying jobs on their graduates. So wealth becomes further concentrated. So the bottom 60% of households in terms of net income, or net wealth actually, saw their net wealth go down by almost 8% between 1983 and 2009, while 80% of the gain in wealth went to the wealthiest 5% of households. Okay, wealth inequality is a different problem and matter than income inequality. So, and a lot of, because it does tend to become concentrated over generations, income can correlate with that as well. But there have been in some countries at various times an inheritance tax of greater or lesser degree. There's still one in the United States, a perpetual item on the wish list of American conservatives is to eliminate the inheritance tax, what they call the death tax. It's not terribly great anyway. In the United States, the first $5.25 million of an estate is exempt from the tax. Now, most households don't have that much wealth by any means, not even close. For a couple, it's $10.25 million, a married couple. So, that's not, and the tax rate, I believe, is progressive. I am not certain, though. Okay, so social mobility, moving from one class to another. You could say that the degree of openness of a class system is measured not simply by how many people rise, but having risen to it, does anybody ever fall out? Or do the people at the top, do their children just inherit their advantages? Well, typically, yeah, that is what happens overall, but you can't apply these statistical observations to individuals. But here are some numbers from Chetty and some other colleagues published in 2014. 7.5% of children born in the top 20% of the U.S. income distribution were in the top 20% as adults. 7% of those born in the bottom 20% had risen to the top 20% as adults, 7.5%. 40% were still in the bottom fifth, the bottom quintile, 20%, whereas 2/3 of the children born to the top 20% were still there as adults. So that's a big difference. There are regional differences as well as racial differences. For instance, 63% of African American children born in the bottom 25% stayed there as adults versus 32% for white children. So um, you can definitely see the evidence that the playing field is not quite level for all of us. Connections are important. Luck is very important. So, all right, moving along. I did not keep up with my. Okay, here's wealth to income ratios. This again is from Piketty and Sayes. By the way, Piketty's published a new, very big book. I'll mention that in a moment. It's not quite as relevant to this. It's to this lecture. It's called Capital and Ideology. So it's more about different sorts of political / ideological economic systems over time, the history of those. You may recall early in this lecture, I talked about the three orders: those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. Many societies around the world were based on a similar system. He called them well, I don't remember his term. I think it's trienarian, which gave rise to proprietarian regimes. And now we've entered the era of hypercapitalism. So I'm going to save all that for this other potential lecture on the sociology of the economy later. Just want to end this with, but anyway, wealth to income ratios, Europe and the US. Here we have Europe, 1914, First World War began, fought in Europe. This ratio dropped quite a bit, but still wealth was about 4 times the income in Europe. In the United States, it stayed a bit higher, went down again during this period of the golden age of capitalism, high taxes and a social compact between unions and capital. Productivity was more widely shared, and you see this beginning to go up again, both in Europe and the United States. The low point in Europe was shortly after the Second World War. You can consider this whole period from 1914 to 1945 really as one long European Civil War. So you can consider yourself poor, or you can actually be poor. You can have trouble putting food on the table, paying the rent, or perhaps you just think you're poor because your car isn't as nice as your neighbor's. That's the difference between absolute and relative poverty. So in absolute poverty, you have trouble surviving and paying the necessary bills, taking care of your family. Relative poverty can be just you don't feel as wealthy. For instance, your lifestyle is not what you think it ought to be. Feminization of poverty is another trend we've seen in the United States and probably the world, where poverty is concentrated in households headed by single parents, which are typically women. Okay. Earlier I mentioned the poverty line. I should mention how they come up with that number. It's still done this way. I'm sure they already have a list. They have a list of how much a certain amount of food costs that a family of 4 needs to survive. And they assume that 1/3 of your income will go towards food. So how much is that food going to cost you over a year's time? Multiply that by 3, and that would be the poverty line. They assume you can pay your rent and everything else out of 2/3 of this income. This is the older poverty line, as you see, 2012, 11,170 for a single adult. Now that doesn't mean the single adult is eligible for many social services. Okay. In 2013, half the world lived on less than $2.50 a day, 80% on less than $10. And Okay, a charitable organization based in the UK, Oxfam International, did a study. They do this study periodically. In 2016, they found that the wealthiest 62 people on Earth have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50%, $1.76 trillion split between, the 50. All right. The wealth of the poorest half has dropped by $1 trillion since, oh, I don't have the year written down. So forget that statistic, but the most important statistic you should take away is that 62 people have as much wealth as half of the people on the planet. You know who some of those are: Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Carlos Slim in Mexico, scattered around. If you're curious who they are, just look for the Forbes 500. You'll get the list and rankings of all the billionaires at any given moment. Doesn't really change all that much. The richest 1% have more wealth than the other 99%. The poorest 10% have an income below $2 a day globally. Famines are not uncommon. A famine is a case where there's a food shortage or a money shortage to buy food. It can be due to drought. It can be due to political conflict. But that is a scourge which we still live with in many parts of the world. Not in the United States for quite some time. Not since the Great Depression did we see truly widespread hunger. But okay, so I'm going to finish with a little theoretical stuff here. Some of the theoretical approaches, a lot of what I've been expressing is coming from the conflict critical theory tradition. So that inequality is inherent, it's part of the capitalist system. It has to have inequality in order to function, really. Structural functionalists, they would say, not surprisingly, inequality is functional. You have inequality of reward so that people will get training in more advanced tasks. You want to reward what's considered the most socially important jobs better than those which you might not consider quite as important. Now there's kind of a problem there, because who is going to determine what jobs are more important than others? I mean, is a lawyer actually more important to society than a school teacher that teaches young children to read? I'm not so sure. But definitely lawyers tend to make quite a bit more money than school teachers. So that idea that inequality is functional and you have to reward people so they'll get the training to do difficult jobs was advanced by two sociologists, Davis and Moore. It's called the Davis and Moore thesis in short. Okay, so we also find, global inequality is definitely something sociologists take a look at, because partly as a result of the legacy of colonialism, of the Europeans controlling a lot of the world through founding colonies and finding individuals in those colonized nations who would kind of help them get the most economic benefit as possible from their colonial empires. That is not, that for the most part, the colonial system ended in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the First World War, France did not give up its colonies. England did not give up their colonies, although there was definitely the request by the colonized at the Versailles Peace Conference of 1918 and 1919 for their freedom, but they were not given it for the most part. So you have a system of global stratification. There's a global division of labor where you tend to have a group of countries, or maybe one principal country and a handful around it, that dominate the world economy. The world systems theory is a theoretical perspective that's carried this to the limit, really. They visualize the world as consisting of a core, certain nations which direct production, which are engaged in design and coordination of the other entities in the economy, which involves exploitation of what one calls the periphery. And between the core and the periphery, you have something called a semi-periphery. In general, some types of primary production takes place in the semi-periphery, and some in the periphery, which would be peripheral countries primarily supply raw materials, commodities, food, metals, oil, those sorts of things. And they tend to be weaker. The core countries are those who seem to have more power over the rest of the system and have more authority to determine how things are going to be. It's not really a colonial system. It's just more or less understood that some nations are going to be more powerful, and it's best to cooperate with things as they are, to accept the status quo. But the core, periphery, and a particular economic system, this whole system, it makes up what the world systems theorists called a world system. So the major theorists, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Christopher Chase Dunn, you don't need to know those names. But the core, the most powerful nation, evolves over time. It's not always the same, and in their view, it will continue to change. Right now, really, the core nation is the United States, but many world systems theorists see China as next in line. What we've seen happening over time, for instance, there was a time when the Dutch, people of the Netherlands, were the core nation. They had taken over that position from the Spanish in the 16th and 17th century. The Spanish colonized the Western Hemisphere. They took silver, mined silver in the New World, and shipped it to Europe and to Asia to buy luxury goods. And they were the dominant nation, really. They had a strong military, a large military, but gradually they became weaker from internal conflict as well as external conflict. And the Dutch, who had a separate system of their own colonies in Asia and in parts of Africa, they became the dominant actor, but much of the financing for what they were doing came from Spanish interests. Spain had accumulated a lot of money, so they became the financiers. The Dutch were out there creating colonies and expropriating raw materials and such. And then later the English and Dutch went to war, and the English dominated the Dutch. The English expanded their colonial empire to India, for instance, and in Ceylon, and parts of Africa around the world. They say the sun never sets on the British Empire because it was global. So, and who was financing a lot of what the British were up to? Well, Dutch money was very important in what the British were doing. And the Dutch were the world's bankers, really. They'd accumulated a lot of money and they were resting on their laurels. So the English were dominant really until the First and Second World War. They began to kind of lose their edge as the most powerful nation on earth after the First World War, and definitely lost it after the Second World War, when the United States became the nation to whom everyone owed money and had the strongest industrial plant and was able to put its military all around the world and dominate the global economy. And guess where a lot of the money to develop the American economy in the late 19th century came from? Well, it was from Britain. It was at the time the hegemon, the core nation. And they continued. They had, there was a lot of wealth in Britain even after this period, after they'd lost their top spot. So world systems rise and fall. There are cycles, Kondratiev cycles, 33 years roughly. I'm not sure where we are in that cycle now, but it may well be the United States is going to lose its position soon to China. Don't worry about these terms. These are from another textbook. And that is really all I have for this lecture, I think. There is more. But here, as I mentioned, the other large Thomas Piketty book, you can see it's making more progress on this than I did on capital in the 21st century. It's a little more interesting, but it is dense as well. So that's it for this lecture. Next up will be racial and ethnic inequality.